50 years ago tonight, a thunderstorm parked itself over a canyon in Colorado and did not move. It dropped up to 14 inches of rain in a few hours onto the Big Thompson Canyon, east of Estes Park. The river in that canyon is normally 1 to 2 feet deep. That evening, it carried a wall of water estimated at 19 feet high, moving at something like 233,000 gallons per second. Down a narrow canyon, holding as many as 3,500 people on a summer Saturday night. 144 people were killed. 250 were injured. More than 800 were lifted out by helicopter. A 10-mile stretch of U.S. Highway 34, the only road through, was simply gone. That was the 31st of July, 1976. Today is the 31st of July, and as I record this, southern Colorado is under flash flood threat for the 4th consecutive day. Red Mountain Pass is closed in both directions. State transportation crews are working at least 8 separate mudslide sites. 2 flash flood emergencies were declared this week, both tagged by the National Weather Service as a particularly dangerous situation. The phrase used when life-threatening flooding is already underway. Nobody has died. I want to say that early and clearly, because this is not a body count story, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. But what has come down those valleys this week is genuinely difficult to look at, and the reason it happened is the most important thing in this report. The water that flooded Beulah on Tuesday was black. In the next 50 minutes, I'll take you through exactly what happened across southern Colorado this week, what it left behind, and why the ground in those valleys is now behaving in a way it never did before. I'll explain the physics of what fire does to soil, which is stranger and more specific than most people realize. I'll cover why the debris matters more than the water, and I'll tell you why the last 10 days of July and the first week of August are, by a very wide margin, the most dangerous window of the year in this state, a pattern that runs through 1976, 1997, 1999, 2021, and now this week. Let's start with the sequence. On Tuesday afternoon, the 28th of July, a thunderstorm developed over southern Colorado and dropped as much as 3 inches of rain in a single hour onto the Aspen Acres fire burn scar, west of Pueblo. The Aspen Acres fire has burned 101,921 acres. As of Wednesday, it was 66% contained, with portions of its western edge still uncontained. Read that again, because it is the detail that captures the whole situation. The fire is still burning, and its own burn scar is already flooding. The water came off that blackened ground and into the creeks below with a force that residents described as unlike anything they had seen. It hit the community of Beulah and the area around Northcreek Road and San Isabel and Wetmore. The Custer County Sheriff's Office reported flooding and road damage around Copper Gulch Road in Wetmore and in the Aspen Acres neighborhood itself. By Wednesday morning, people were out cleaning up. Sarah Bassett, whose family has lived in the area for decades, was working around her parents' property near Northcreek Road. She said the force of the water was just unreal. Then Wednesday evening, it happened again. The rains returned with force. Around 7 in the evening, the National Weather Service issued a flash flood emergency near the Gold Mountain Fire burn scar in Ouray County, just northeast of Ponderosa Village, running through 9. Shortly after, around 7:30, a second flash flood emergency was issued for the Aspen Acres scar. Running through 10. Forecasters warned residents in the northern and central parts of that scar, including Beulah, San Isabel, and Wetmore, and issued an emergency evacuation order. Both emergencies carried the particularly dangerous situation tag. Officials warned that up to 3 inches of rain could fall in as little as an hour. 2 flash flood emergencies in 2 different burn scars on opposite sides of the state within 30 minutes of each other. And by Thursday morning, the picture in southwestern Colorado had become serious in a different way. Intense flooding near the Gold Mountain Scar forced evacuations between Ridgway and Ouray and closed sections of U.S. Highway 550. Officials warned residents near Ponderosa Village and Cutler Creek Drive to evacuate or move to higher ground. Red Mountain Pass, between Silverton and Ouray, was closed in both directions. The Colorado Department of Transportation had crews responding to at least 8 separate mudslide areas along it. If you do not know Red Mountain Pass, it is one of the most dramatic and most exposed stretches of highway in North America. A section of the so-called $1 Million Highway, cut into near vertical mountainside at over 11,000 feet, with sheer drops and no guardrails across long stretches. 8 active mudslide sites on that road is not an inconvenience. It is a major closure on a route with very few alternatives. And this was not the first time this month. The weekend before, heavy rains caused mudslides that buried State Highway 145 between Placerville and Norwood Hill under 4 to 5 feet of debris. There was flooding on roads in Garfield County on the 20th of July. Now let me tell you what this actually left behind, because the physical character of it is what makes people react the way they do. Photographs released by the Pueblo County Sheriff's Office showed at least one vehicle caught in the floodwater. The runoff carried burned trees, rocks, and propane tanks downhill. Propane tanks. Whole tanks, torn from properties and carried down valleys in the current. On Northcreek Road, debris clogged a bridge, a solid mass of burned timber and rock jammed against the structure. One photograph taken on Wednesday shows a garter snake lying among the silt covering a bridge railing, which tells you how high the material got and how completely it coated everything it touched. And the silt itself is the thing residents keep returning to. Bassett described black silt covering absolutely everything, including her clothes, through Wednesday afternoon. It made the cleanup miserable. That is why this is hard to look at. Not because of the scale of destruction. This is not a town wiped off a map. It is because of what the material is. What came down those creeks was not muddy water. It was the incinerated remains of 100,000 acres of forest, liquefied and pushed downhill into people's yards, their bridges, their driveways, and their homes. The fire took the mountainside in June and July. This week, the mountainside arrived at their front doors. Bassett summed up the mood in a way that I think is more accurate than any official statement. She said the people up there just can't catch a break. And she made one other point that matters, which I will come back to at the end. The flooding was not a surprise. Her neighbors had already prepared by stacking sandbags. Most homes in that area sit above the floodplain. They knew this was coming. Which raises the obvious question: how? The answer is that everyone in Colorado who lives below a burn scar knows what happens next. Because the relationship between fire and flood in this landscape is one of the best understood and most reliably predicted hazards in the American West. And it works in a way that most people, quite reasonably, get completely wrong. The intuitive assumption about rain after a fire is that it helps. The fire was caused by dryness. Rain is the opposite of dryness. Therefore, rain is good. Charles Balk, co-coordinator of the Southwest Incident Management Team and chief of the Palisade Fire Department, has identified this as one of the most common mistakes people make. His point is that a large amount of moisture arriving all at once does not soak into the soil and improve fuel moisture at all. It stays at the surface, runs downhill, and dissipates somewhere else entirely. So a downpour on a burn scar does not water the ground, it runs off it. There are 3 separate reasons for that, and they compound. The first is the loss of the canopy. In an intact forest, rain does not fall directly onto the soil. It hits leaves and needles first, and a meaningful fraction of it never reaches the ground at all. It clings to foliage and evaporates. What does get through arrives slowly, dripping from branches over a much longer period than the storm itself lasted. That interception is a natural rainfall delay mechanism. It spreads a violent 1-hour downpour across several hours of gentle delivery, which is exactly what allows soil to absorb it. Burn away the canopy, and every drop hits bare ground at full velocity, all at once. The second is the loss of the litter layer and the root network. A forest floor is not soil. It is a deep, spongy mat of needles, leaves, twigs, and decomposing organic matter, and it is extraordinarily absorbent. Beneath it, root systems bind soil particles together and create channels through which water can penetrate downward. Fire consumes the litter layer completely and kills the roots. What is left is bare mineral soil with no structure, no absorbency, and nothing holding it in place. The third reason is the strangest, and it is the one that turns a bad situation into a dangerous one. Fire chemically alters the soil itself. Plants and organic matter contain waxy, resinous compounds. When a fire burns hot, those compounds vaporize. The vapor moves downward into the cooler soil below the surface, and when it reaches a layer cool enough, it condenses and coats the soil particles, forming a waxy, water-repellent layer, typically an inch or two below the surface. Soil scientists call this hydrophobicity. The ground becomes physically incapable of absorbing water. AccuWeather meteorologist Alyssa Smithmeyer described the result precisely. Soil after a wildfire is greatly modified and, in her phrase, comparable to pavement in terms of its repelling nature. Pavement. That is the correct mental model, and it changes everything about how you read the rainfall figure. When forecasters warned of up to 3 inches of rain in an hour over the Aspen Acres scar, they were not describing 3 inches falling on a forest. They were describing 3 inches falling on 100,000 acres of steep, sloping, unvegetated pavement, all of it draining into a small number of narrow creeks. Think of the difference between pouring water onto a lawn and pouring the same water onto a tilted driveway. The lawn takes it. The driveway sends all of it to the bottom, immediately, in a sheet. That is why a rainfall total that would be entirely unremarkable in an unburned watershed produces a flash flood emergency in a burned one. The rain has not changed. The ground has. Now, the second half of the mechanism, and the reason this is more dangerous than ordinary flooding. What comes down off a burn scar is usually not water. It is a debris flow. The distinction is not academic. A flood is water that has risen. A debris flow is a moving mixture of water, mud, ash, rock, sand, and vegetation, and it behaves like a different substance entirely. Here is how it forms. Water sheeting off hydrophobic soil immediately begins stripping loose ash and sediment, of which a burn scar has an effectively unlimited supply. As the flow picks up material, it becomes denser and heavier. A denser flow has more energy, which lets it pick up larger objects, gravel, then cobbles, then boulders, then whole trees. Engineers call this progressive bulking. The flow arms itself as it descends. By the time it reaches the valley floor, it can be more solid than liquid, something closer to wet concrete moving at speed. That is what allows a flow only a couple of feet deep to move vehicles, tear out bridges, and carry propane tanks down a canyon. It is the difference between being knocked over by a wave and being hit by a truck. Water pushes. A debris flow strikes. It also explains the black silt that Bassett described covering everything. When the flow slows and spreads out across flatter ground, it drops its load, and what settles out is the ash and charcoal fraction, deposited as a fine black layer over roads, bridges, fields, gardens, and clothing. That is 100,000 acres of burned forest, redistributed downhill. And there is a further hazard that this week demonstrated on Red Mountain Pass. On very steep terrain, the same process produces mud and rock slides rather than creek-borne debris flows, saturated unbound slope material simply failing and sliding. 8 separate sites on a single mountain pass, which is why that road remains closed. So how long does a burn scar stay dangerous? Longer than almost anyone expects. The hydrophobic layer itself breaks down over months to a couple of years, as soil organisms, freeze-thaw cycles, and physical disturbance degrade the waxy coating. But hydrophobicity is only one of the 3 factors. Vegetation recovery is the slow one. Grasses and shrubs may return within a couple of seasons. A root network capable of binding a steep slope takes far longer. Forest canopy takes decades. The rule of thumb used by land managers is that elevated debris flow risk persists for something in the range of 2 to 5 years after a fire, with the highest risk in the first 1 to 3, and with steep, high-severity burn areas at the top of that range. Colorado has a documented case that shows just how long the tail can be. Rain falling on the Grizzly Creek burn scar closed Interstate 70 through Glenwood Canyon for weeks in 2021, following storms in late July of that year, with the worst of it on the 30th and 31st. That fire had burned the previous summer. A full year later, the scar was still generating flows capable of shutting one of the most important east-west highways in the United States, which brings us back to Aspen Acres, and the detail I flagged earlier. That fire is still burning. It was 66% contained on Wednesday, with parts of its western edge open. It has consumed 101,921 acres. The communities below it are dealing with debris flows off a scar that is not yet finished being created. And whatever the final acreage turns out to be, the hazard those valleys are now living with does not end when the fire is declared out. It runs for years. Every monsoon storm between now and roughly 2029 or 2030 is going to be a question mark over Beulah, San Isabel, Wetmore, and the Aspen Acres neighborhood. The same applies to the Gold Mountain Scar above Ouray County, where residents near Ponderosa Village and Cutler Creek Drive were told to evacuate or reach higher ground on Wednesday night. That is the part that does not make the news. The fire is a dramatic event with a clear beginning and end. The flood risk it creates is a slow, multi-year condition that arrives every time a thunderstorm sits over the wrong ridge. And in Colorado, there is a specific window when those thunderstorms are most likely. And we are in the middle of it right now. Colorado State University's Climate Center keeps a record of every flood, flash flood, and debris flow report in the state going back to 1996, plotted by calendar day. The shape of that curve is remarkable. There is a modest bump in early to mid-June. There is a spike in September. And then there is a sharp, unmistakable peak, covering roughly the last 10 days of July and the first week of August, when the state sees by far the most flash flood activity of the year. We are, at this moment, at the top of that peak. The reason is the North American monsoon. Through July, the large-scale wind pattern over the southwest shifts, drawing moist air northward from the Gulf of California and the Gulf of Mexico into Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado. That moisture arrives over terrain that heats intensely during the day, and the combination produces afternoon and evening thunderstorms that can be extraordinarily efficient rainfall producers over very small areas. Two things make monsoon storms uniquely dangerous in mountains. They are slow-moving or nearly stationary, so they empty over one catchment rather than sweeping across many. And they arrive over terrain that funnels everything into narrow canyons. Now look at the dates in Colorado's flood history. The Big Thompson Canyon flood. The 31st of July, 1976. The Fort Collins flood. The 28th of July, 1997. The Saguache Creek flood in the San Luis Valley. The 25th of July, 1999. The Grizzly Creek burn scar storms that closed Interstate 70 for weeks, late July 2021, worst on the 30th and 31st. And this week, flash flood emergencies on the 28th and 29th of July 2026. Those are not coincidences. They are the same meteorological setup, arriving in the same window on the same terrain across 50 years. So let me tell you properly about the anniversary that falls today, because it is the event that shaped how this state thinks about water. On Saturday, the 31st of July, 1976, Colorado was celebrating its centennial. The Big Thompson Canyon, running west from Loveland up toward Estes Park, was full, a popular destination for hiking, camping, and fishing, with cabins. Motels and campgrounds strung along the river. Larimer County officials later estimated as many as 3,500 people were in the canyon that evening, including around 600 permanent residents. A thunderstorm developed just east of Estes Park and stalled. Over a few hours, it dropped up to 14 inches of rain onto the upper canyon. The Big Thompson River is normally 1 to 2 feet deep. What came down the canyon that night was estimated at up to 19 feet of water, moving at something like 233,000 gallons per second. It destroyed cabins, homes and buildings along the river. It carried away vehicles. It tore out a 10-mile stretch of U.S. Highway 34, which was the only road through the canyon, meaning the route people would have used to escape was destroyed by the same water they were escaping. 144 people were killed. 250 were injured. Damage was around $39 million in 1976 terms. More than 800 people were evacuated by helicopter, and the work of emergency responders is credited with keeping the toll from being far higher. It remained the deadliest flash flood in the United States for 49 years, until the Guadalupe River flood in Texas on the 4th of July last year. And Big Thompson produced one specific permanent change that you can still see today. Many of the people who died were in their cars. When the water rose, the instinct was to drive out along the canyon road, and the road ran beside the river, so driving out meant driving through the flood. Vehicles were swept away with people inside them. The lesson was so stark that Colorado put it on metal. Signs went up in canyons across the state, reading, in effect, climb to safety. Abandon the vehicle. Go up the canyon wall, on foot, immediately. That single instruction, up, not out, has saved an unknown number of lives in the 50 years since. And it is exactly the instruction that Ouray County officials were giving residents near Ponderosa Village on Wednesday night. Evacuate or move to higher ground. 50 years apart. Same state, same season, same advice. Now let me be honest about what this week is and is not, because there is a version of this report that overstates it. Nobody has died. As of this recording, there are no reported fatalities from this week's flooding in Colorado. The evacuations were ordered in advance of the worst of it. The warnings were specific, named communities, named roads, defined time windows. The flash flood emergencies were issued before the peak, not after. And the residents were ready. Bassett's account is the most instructive thing in the entire story. The flooding was not a surprise. Her neighbors had already stacked sandbags, and most homes in the area sit above the floodplain. That is a community that understood its risk and had acted on it. This is not a disaster. It is a serious, damaging, frightening week in which a well-understood hazard behaved exactly as predicted, and the people in its path were largely prepared for it. The damage is real. Roads buried, bridges clogged, at least one vehicle caught, property covered in ash and debris, a major mountain pass closed with 8 slide sites, and a cleanup that will take a long time and cost real money. But the reason this is a story about mud rather than about funerals is that everyone involved knew what a burn scar does and acted accordingly. Which is, I think, the actual lesson of the anniversary. Here's what I'll be watching. The first is the immediate forecast. Additional thunderstorms were forecast for late Thursday and beyond, and we are still inside the peak climatological window through the first week of August. Every storm that develops over the Aspen Acres or Gold Mountain Scars is another event. The second is Red Mountain Pass. 8 mudslide sites on that highway is a significant closure, and the reopening timeline will tell you how much material actually came down. Watch Colorado Department of Transportation updates rather than weather coverage. The third is containment on the Aspen Acres fire. It stood at 66% with an open western edge. Any further growth expands the scar, and therefore the drainage area feeding these flows. The fourth is post-fire hazard assessment. After large fires, the U.S. Geological Survey produces debris flow hazard assessments modeling which drainages are most likely to produce flows and at what rainfall intensities. Those products are how communities below a scar learn which specific creeks to worry about, and they are worth looking for. The fifth is the multi-year picture. The elevated risk below these scars runs for years, not months. The meaningful question is not whether Beulah floods again this August. It is what mitigation gets funded before the 2027 and 2028 monsoons, sediment basins, culvert upgrades, early warning gauges on the specific drainages above these communities. And the sixth is the rest of the season. Colorado's flash flood curve has a second spike in September, associated with the Great Colorado Flood of 2013. Burn scars do not observe seasonal boundaries. I want to end on the two images from this week that I cannot get out of my head. The first is a garter snake, lying among black silt on a bridge railing outside Beulah, where the debris flow deposited it and everything else it was carrying. The second is that highway sign, bolted up in Colorado canyons after 1976, telling people that when the water comes, they should leave the car and climb. 50 years ago tonight, 144 people died in a canyon in this state because nobody knew that yet, and because the only road out ran alongside the river. This week, in 2 different Colorado counties, people were told to get to higher ground before the water arrived, and they did. And they are cleaning ash off their clothes instead of being counted. The mountainside came down. Everyone is still here. We'll be watching the forecasts through the first week of August.